Hi, everyone. My name is Melissa Kline. I'm a research scientist at the Center for Open Science, and I'm going to be talking a little bit today about open science and some steps that we can take to improve the openness, transparency, and robustness of our research. So in case you guys aren't familiar with the Center for Open Science, this is a nonprofit that's located in Virginia in the States that focuses on a number of issues around helping scientists to make choices that are going to help to make our science more transparent and more robust. So we do a few different things. We build different types of infrastructure. That's most of what I'm going to be talking about today to kind of provide us with tools that we need. We do meta-science research, so research on science and scientists is kind of most of what my job involves, and then also a variety of kind of community building activities to help to make these ideas more mainstream and to help people kind of find other folks who are doing similar research to them that they might be able to take inspiration from. So the way that we can think about the choices that we make as scientists, it can be nice to think about this as not just a, from beginning to end process where first you have some hypotheses and then you design a study and then eventually you get to publish your results in a journal, but instead to think about this as sort of a continuing life cycle where kind of at every point, you might be at multiple points with a project, but your science is just sort of kind of steadily evolving, steadily moving forward. And at every point, you're going to have some chances to think about the choices you might want to make. One of the things I think you guys will have already talked about at this point in the course is that when you are looking at a scientific career, a lot of the incentives or the things that you're kind of maybe being told explicitly or maybe just kind of seeing around you, the things that are going to kind of maybe push you towards career success are things that help you get your papers published. And because that's the kind of driving focus, that can pull apart from the incentives that you have to get things right. So we kind of bounce back and forth at Center for Open Science between talking about like these sort of easy steps that we can try to take on to make things better. But I do also think that it's important to acknowledge that these are things that might be different from the way that you're used to working, or they might require more effort. And it does put us in a tough spot, right? Like the things that are going to get our paper published yesterday might not be the things that are going to, make our science really, really strong or really get us a little bit closer to the truth. And so it's this kind of just constant balancing act all over the place. So in psychology and the social sciences as well, there are a few specific things that we can think about as representing threats or challenges to the robustness of our science. So the first would be small sample sizes, especially when you're doing, really in-depth new experimental research, or if you're working with populations that are relatively small or relatively hard to contact, we can get smaller sample sizes than we might want. People selectively reporting only some of the results that they found, maybe cherry picking the stuff that tells the best story, flexibility in analyses, and we'll talk a little bit later about how we can use that flexibility like really, really creatively and wonderfully while also sort of preserving the challenges of saying what we meant to do up front without kind of going down this garden of forking paths and creating doubt about how we're interpreting our studies. And then a big one is ignoring null results. And so not just for individual scientists saying like, oh, well, like, whoops, like my study came out with a null result that's not very interesting. But even if you think it's a really interesting result, it can be more challenging to get a journal to sign up to publish that null result. It can be seen as not so exciting. Some other challenges that we can think about that are a little bit less, they can seem a little bit less deep or a little bit less kind of really, really principled. Like it's really easy to see why a bigger sample size is going to give you a little bit more certainty or a little bit more accuracy about whatever it is that you're measuring than a smaller sample size, right? Like that's a pretty like broad generalization you can make, but there's this whole other class of threats to the robustness and transparency and repeatability of our research, which basically comes down to documentation and keeping good records of what you're doing. So this can be disorganization of general materials. This can be actually losing track of those materials, maybe especially after a study is finished, and a lack of norms or practices around sharing data with each other. If you don't see anyone else around you sharing your data, you may not take that extra effort, and then there just becomes this culture of that data just not really being available to each other. Great. So when we think about the ways that we might use open science. And by open science, I'm going to be talking about some of the different things that I've got up right now. So we can talk about open access to our journal articles themselves, right? So we've all encountered paywalls when we're trying to read scientific articles that, keep people from being able to access the actual outcomes of those research. So one thing that we work on a lot at COS and that you'll see a lot of people working a lot on is open access to the research articles themselves, right? So just really the outputs of that research. We also, when we talk about open science, we talk about open data. So like actually the real underlying data that underlies those conclusions that we came to in the paper, and then also open workflows. And that can include everything from the materials or surveys or instruments or whatever else it is that you're using to actually run your experiment or conduct your survey or access your data set, all the way through to the workflows and how we analyze our data, right? And that can be, again, be anything from detailed instructions on how you want to set up a spreadsheet or how you want to run some calculations by hand, all the way through to like analysis scripts that you might use to run that. So these are all kind of different pieces of the open science puzzle. There's a lot of other ones. A lot of times when we talk about open science, we also want to talk about equity and access, right? So when we talk about open, we can think about who is this open to, both in terms of who can access it, like in what countries or at what institutions, and also is it accessible in the sense of like, is there enough here that someone who's coming into it maybe from another area can get oriented and get access to the parts that they're interested in. I'm hoping that by this point in the course, you guys are all getting a sense of why we're going to really care about issues like this. We know that irreproducibility slows things down. So if you've ever worked on a study where you're trying to move forward from work that someone else has done or even that yourself has done, if you can't get good details about how that study is supposed to be run, you spend a lot of time reinventing a wheel or trying to kind of reconstruct whatever might have gone on. It's also just harder to be sure that the study that you're doing really is building off the previous one. You might be unsure about whether or not you're doing the same thing as someone else has done. And if you're working away, on your own and you're, keeping results to yourself unless they come out in like an interesting or novel way, it could be the case that lots of people are trying this out. And we've got like multiple file drawers or multiple papers that, they're a dead end. This really isn't going to go anywhere, but you didn't tell anybody else that. And so now you've got multiple people all kind of, trying this again and again. Another reason to think about why you should care about open science actually just has to do with openness with yourself. I really like this quote a lot. Your most likely collaborator is yourself 6 months from now, and your past self doesn't answer email. So a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about here are sort of designed with the idea of sharing with somebody else or making your plans and your outcomes transparent to somebody else, but they'll also just set you up for success in your own work, right? When you come back to your study 6 months later, you don't really remember what was going on. If you have that clear documentation, if you have all your materials in that same place, it's just going to make it a lot easier for you to kind of move forward with that. So what I'm going to talk about for most of the rest of this are some kind of practical steps that you can take to take on open science practices. So at COS, we talk a lot about like open science practices or open science behaviors, just sort of like really concrete steps that you can take to try to make your work a little bit more open, transparent, and robust. And something to keep in mind here is that all of these suggestions are on a continuum and they might not all be appropriate for your exact type of research. I'll talk a little bit about this when we get to data sharing, but none of these specific actions are mandatory, and there are lots of ways to accomplish each one of these types of behaviors. They're the types of things where you can kind of look at it as a menu and kind of say like, which of these I'm going to take on right now, which of these are the ones that's going to maybe give me the most bang for my buck if I add this one new thing onto my study. So this is a learning process. Like you absolutely should not be expecting to get this perfectly right the first time. And it can also, I think, be sort of empowering to know that there isn't necessarily really a right way because this is all very new, right? Like at some point, I looked this up at one point, and I can't remember the date anymore, but at some point very early in the 20th century, the American Psychological Association sat down and wrote that APA article format that, we might be familiar with, where it goes introduction, then methods, then results, then conclusions, right? So that's kind of like a standard approach that people wrote down and started adhering to. There are some ideas that are starting to be coalesced around these steps that we can take, but a lot of open science is like brand new. Like a lot of these things are new in the last 10 years. And it really is a case where scientists are actually just sort of figuring this out all together. So if you're looking at something and you're saying, gosh, I'm not really sure how to apply this in my particular situation, that could honestly be because you're breaking pretty new ground. That's a place where the open science community can be really valuable because there probably are people out there who maybe have done something similar to you or who are able to say like, oh yeah, gosh, like, no, we haven't done this before. Let's see if we can figure this out. Okay, so the first thing that I'll talk about as a way that we can try to make our science more open or set ourselves up for success is creating kind of a structured plan or workspace for your research. So maybe the most basic way to think about this is if you're doing a study, you've got a whole different variety of materials, maybe you've got data sets or you've got materials, you've got analysis scripts, whatever it is, you want to keep them all in one place, right? Or if there's a reason you need to have more than one place, you want a map that's going to really clearly lay out where can I find everything that, has to do with this research. I know this might seem like very, very basic, but it is one of those things that can be hard to kind of keep track of just as you're downloading different files or you're passing things back and forth with collaborators if you don't kind of take this on as something that's a little bit more intentional. So when you're thinking about how you're going to be doing your study, this is something it's great to think about at the beginning of your study. But if you're in the middle of a project, this is also something that you can just start to look around and start to improve as you go. But the thing that you might be wanting to think about is what files or physical materials do you actually need to store? You might want to think about who needs access to those materials. So maybe in your lab or with your collaborators, who needs to be able to access it, and if it shouldn't be shared with everyone, what are the things that really need to be kept safe? And then you also might be thinking about like, when do these things need to be shared? Or, when do my collaborators need access to this stuff? This is all basically just thinking about planning ahead, right? And it's, it's something that you're not going to ever get every single detail of how you're going to manage a project straight from the very beginning. But again, this is the kind of thing where you can kind of just set things up over time. So I'm going to show you just 3 quick examples here that are from the perspective of like a head of a lab who's organizing things for their graduate students or for their other research members. But this is also something that you can imagine setting up for yourself if if your lab's not providing or your research group is not imposing a structure on you, you can make up one for yourself. So it could be super simple here, right? So this is just saying, hey, if you're doing a project file, you need to make sure that you're including your materials, data file where you can really easily tell which of all of these files is the data one. So clearly labeled syntax. So here this is referring to like an analysis script of some kind. If you've got summaries of results, include them. You should put the manuscript in there or manuscript graphs as you go and any of the important figures. Here's a much more complex one. This is coming from another lab. Every row here is a single study where they're just sort of keeping track of some of the major steps in the research project. So some important things here are they're giving a web link for a place on the OSF where their whole project is stored. I'll talk a little bit more about how that looks in practice, as well as just sort of checking off some important steps along the way, and then other links to important files that they have. And then this is another method that I really like, which is that here's a professor who's actually just set up a template for their lab members where they're basically saying, every time you start a new project, you're going to basically just make a copy of the same structure. These are folders, essentially. You can say, this is how we're going to set everything up. We're all going to do the same thing. And then that's going to make it easier for us to understand each other's projects. Okay, so I've given you a little bit of a preview of the OSF website itself. I would strongly encourage you all to take a look at this website that's right down here. Oops. Make an account if you haven't had one before. This is a free website. It's a place where you can store all your research materials, and it's designed to share with your to share with your collaborators, or maybe to share more broadly. It's also meant to give you a place where you can document what it is that you're doing. So if you have particular files that are super important, you can say not only here's this file, it's somewhere other than my own laptop, so it's a little safer, but also you can have a place to record this is what these files are and this is how you use them. And then it also provides you a place to be, archiving those things in the long term. So if you go to a page on the OSF, you might see something like this. So this is a study that's actually all the way finished, but it's keeping track of a number of different pieces. And the thing to notice here, excuse me, a thing to notice here is that right now we're looking at this as this is the public view of the project. So you're going to get a little bit of information about what the project is about. And then a component, which is basically just a folder saying like, here's where you can get some more information about the paper. The OSF is designed so that you can really put absolutely any file of any type on there. So here we've got someone who's got, this very, very cool like 3D fish skeletons project. But you can see that they're sharing data, they're sharing pictures, they're sharing these like great 3D renderings. Any file that you can store on your computer, you can store on the OSF. And something else that's really cool, I mentioned earlier that we were looking at kind of like a public view of that project. One of the things that's really, really nice about the OSF is that it lets you kind of take your whole project, have it all in one place, and then selectively choose which parts of that are going to be made, public for the entire internet or, for the readers of your paper or whoever. So what this might look like is as you're going along in your study, maybe you've got some research materials and an analysis plan, and then maybe a more general procedure. These little locks are showing you that right now on this project, these first two components are private. They can only be seen by these people who are, contributors to the project. And then you've got this other one that's public for anybody. And there's a very straightforward process to make individual components of your research public when you want to. So a very common pattern with OSF projects is maybe when you're starting and you're getting everything set up, you might have your whole project be private. And then as you go along and things are getting ready, you can say like, okay, now I'm ready to share this part of my project, and you can just flip that over into being public. Another big advantage to using the OSF to store and organize your project materials is that you can get an easy way to cite parts of your research that maybe aren't a full paper yet. So if you've got a project or a series of materials that are ready, you can just use, there's going to be a persistent website that anybody can visit that's going to give you a chance to easily share your materials. You can see an example of how you might cite it here. This is also just a really, really convenient way to share your materials with your collaborators. So if you've been in the position where you're just like emailing papers back and forth, different versions of files, that can get really messy. This gives you, just like a nice kind of predictable place for all your files to wind up. Okay, so we talked a little bit about some ways that you can, structure and set up your research. And so next what I'll talk a little bit about is pre-registration. And I'm going to talk about pre-registration in two parts. The first is pre-registration as a way to help you document and make your work transparent. And then the second is going to have to do specifically with some classes of confirmatory analyses. So when we think about pre-registration, what we're talking about is writing down what we're planning on doing. So you can include some general information about what you're investigating and how. So what's your research question? What population are you going to be studying? What sample size are you trying to get to? Information about the design, recording variables that you're going to be collecting, or if there's a specific data set that you'll be using, you can record that. So there's a few reasons to do this. The first is that because you're starting at the very beginning before you've collected your data or found your results, you're putting some work in up front to, kind of make a record of what it is that you're doing. This is a way to help prevent against the file door problem, because even if you're not going to wind up publishing a study, like maybe you get to the end and you say, actually, you know what, this is maybe not only a null result, but I actually think there's something weird about this experiment, or maybe these results aren't all that informative, but you can still make them public. Right? So then this becomes the type of thing that could show up in a literature search. You could search the OSF for public projects, and you might be able to say like, hey, these people never published, but I can see that they tried something here. I can learn a little about it. Maybe I can contact those people and find out more if I need to. But it becomes a way that, even if a project winds up being a dead end, it's not nothing, right? You still have some kind of a record of your project. And then also, when you're doing this, taking this step of, writing down what it is that you're planning to do and why, this is another example of using sort of open science kinds of behaviors to just help yourself organize and plan your own research, right? So this can be something like when you're starting out on a project, this might feel really fresh and top of mind, and it's really clear to you while you're doing it. And maybe in 8 months, when you've been like swimming around in the data or trying different things, you can kind of lose sight of what you were hoping to do. And this is a kind of a document that can just really orient you to kind of keep you on track with your goals and help you figure out what were you planning to do and why, and just kind of keep your project moving forward in that way. There's a second thing that pre-registration is going to accomplish, which is distinguishing confirmatory from exploratory research. So when you're doing confirmatory research, sorry, there we go. So when you're doing confirmatory research, what we're talking about there is you're setting up a set of analyses before you're going to actually look at your data or find out any details about what your data is for a few reasons. So there's some sort of technical hypothesis testing reasons to keep these confirmatory tests separate out from exploratory work, but also identifying your specific analyses that you're going to run in your data before you actually get into it is a great way to decrease researcher degrees of freedom. So one way that we can think about researcher degrees of freedom is all of the choices that you're going to find yourself faced with when you're actually looking at and interacting with your data. So maybe you set out to collect 100 observations and you get them back and you realize that, gosh, 90 people filled out this form entirely, but 10 people skipped at least one question, right? So should I include those results or should I not include them? Should I impute some values for those missing data? Should I drop those cases entirely? Maybe I'm looking at my data, I'm saying like, okay, well, I thought that 100 subjects would be enough, but now I'm seeing only a little bit of an effect. Should I test some more subjects? Maybe if I have multiple dependent variables, like which of those should I pick? Maybe I thought I was looking for some, simple or main effects, and now I'm thinking there might be some kind of an interaction that I want to explore. The thing that I want to make super, super clear about these things is that these are all like really important and great and creative parts of the scientific process. All of these things are like normal important steps in the process of generating hypotheses, right? So the place where we're going to get into trouble is when we start treating this process of generating hypotheses as though it's testing a confirmatory hypothesis. So when we think about the famous p less than 0.05, the assumptions that are lying behind the statistical test that we use in that context are making the assumption that you're not doing lots and lots of monkeying around with the things that we talked about on the last slide, that you set everything up beforehand. You're not testing and testing and testing again, so doing a different t-test on each one of those different choices that I was showing you. Because if you keep on doing this, the more likely you are that something that's really a null effect is going to pop up with a p less than 0.05. So these are some examples here of types of risks that you can run into. If you have more than one dependent variable, you're raising the chance that you could have a false positive. If you did those 100 subjects and then you said, hey, actually, I think I'd like to add a little bit more, now that you're kind of sampling and resampling, you might inflate your false positive problem. A few other things that you can add here. And essentially what you can see is that as you start doing more and more of these, your chances of accidentally observing a false positive when there's maybe not something quite so robust there can start to rise really quickly. So pre-registering a specific analysis plan is one solution to this. Again, it's really going to help you with the planning because maybe you're going to take a minute to step back and think like, oh, okay, like what will I do if somebody doesn't answer all the questions on my survey, right? And by specifying some specific things like the sample size that you'll be going to or your stopping rule when you're going to stop collecting data, the specific cleaning procedures that you'll do, the specific analyses that you'll run, all of these things are going to help protect you against these false positive increases when you're doing confirmatory analyses. The other thing that's important about these pre-registrations is that you're not just kind of making these decisions for yourself and maybe, talking them out in a lab meeting or writing them down in a file on your computer, but you want to put them somewhere where they're going to be read-only, so you can't go back and change them, and they've got a date attached to them. And what that's going to let you do is later on, you're going to be able to say like, hey, I collected my data in October, but look, I can show you this pre-registration from August to show you that I made these decisions earlier on. Okay, so to talk a little bit more about confirmatory versus exploratory hypotheses, the things that we want to keep in mind here is that our p-values, when we're doing confirmatory research, these are going to become more interpretable, right? So you understand what your risk of a false positive is because you're meeting the assumptions that go along with those tests. When you're running lots and lots and lots of tests over and over again because you're exploring your data, which again is a thing you absolutely should be doing, the thing to keep track of here is that the size of the effects that you're seeing may be interesting and may be worth looking into, but that like key interpretive inferential step of saying like, not only is there an effect here, but I want to say that that effect is significantly different from zero, this is where you're going to get into trouble over here. So the thing that we want to keep in mind here is that when we take all of this like great, wonderful exploration that we're doing over here and we present it as though it's confirmatory, as though we made these particular set of choices rather than exploring all of our options, we're inflating that false positive rate. We're probably making our results more publishable because everybody likes a p less than 0.05 result, but it's coming at the cost of the credibility of our results, right? And so you can really see why there's some risk or why there's some, opportunities for slippage here, because if you're over here exploring your data and you suddenly notice that there's a big effect that you, didn't see before, that's really exciting. You want to tell the world about it. And frankly, you should. The only thing that you want to be clear about is you want to be clear that that's something that you found in the context of exploration. And so one way that we can think about what pre-registration is doing is that it's helping us to just make this distinction clear, right? So if you're going forward with you're doing a study, if you have specific hypotheses that you're testing that you want to really crisply set up, you can make those clear, and then you can just say like, hey, this is what I plan to do, and then something went crazy, something unexpected happened, something had to change, and here's what I did. And so again, this is something where I was talking a little bit about norms before, or kind of changing what we're used to seeing. This can feel a little weird because you probably have read a lot of papers that didn't make this distinction, right? Where you read papers which said like, I found this result, and I found this result, and I found this result. And oh, maybe by the way, this one wasn't that significant, but this is what I found. It's becoming a little bit more common to say like, here, this was my confirmatory test. This is what I set out to find. And then having done that, we also observe these other things in a more exploratory context, right? That's a way that you can write papers. That's a way that people are kind of more and more starting to draw that distinction. But like, I do also just want to acknowledge that like, when you read papers, you may not see this. This is a new thing, right? Another thing that I want to point out is that you might be in a position where you don't have a specific hypothesis, and that's also fine. You may be going, for instance, into a large data set looking for things to observe, right? And in that case, you might still make a pre-registration to help you kind of lay out what your plan is or how you're going to constrain your exploration or, what approaches you're going to take. And you can even take the opportunity to say in the pre-registration, I'm not going to do any confirmatory hypothesis testing. That's not what this study is, right? And then you can show up, you get your data, and you can do the exploration and still have that pre-registration there to keep you honest and just give you the opportunity to say, look, this isn't confirmatory hypothesis testing. This is exploration of, maybe an important new data set or an important new question. So when we're thinking about how we pre-register, if you wanted, you could write up your pre-registration, maybe like print it out, put it in an envelope and write the date on it. But one of the things that the OSF is going to let you do is to create a pre-registration. So I talked a little bit earlier about how OSF gives you a place to put your files on the internet. It can also give you the ability to take those files, provide some information alongside of it, and then just do like a timestamp to say like, hey, here's some analysis code that I wrote ahead of time, and here's some information about my plans. And then later on, have that just really cleanly associated with the data or the analyses or whatever else you add later on. So basically, when you're on the OSF, when you're making these registrations, you're taking your project and then you're adding this notion of the plan that you're going to be doing going forward. And it lets you basically just have this timeline of results, and you're saying, this is a special point in my timeline. This is when I'm going to be presenting. This is when I'm going to be pre-registering the confirmatory hypotheses or my plan that I'm going to be conducting. All right, so that's pre-registration. Another thing that I want to talk about that can do wonders for your research management plans and that can help with future transparency is to archive and keep track of versions of your files as you go. So rather than either trying to predict absolutely everything up front, which you probably won't succeed at, or trying to say like, okay, like thank goodness my data is all analyzed, I got the draft out, I've submitted it to a journal, oh gosh, what are all these files? Like, let me try to organize these and put them up online. If you instead archive your versions as you go, you're going to be in a position where you don't have a big surprise workload at the end, and you can also keep in mind what you're going to be sharing or what you're going to be archiving kind of from the beginning of the project, which might help you make some better decisions about kind of where and how you're going to keep your materials. And along with this is the notion of sharing what you can when you can. So we often think of open science as this ideal where, absolutely everything is available to everybody right away. That might not be the case, right? You might have good reasons to keep aspects of your project private, or you might just not be comfortable sharing it. You might want to wait until, things are a little bit more finished up or a little bit more polished. But if you start keeping your files on the OSF in private components, you can basically be getting yourself ready to share. There's a lot of different materials that we can think about wanting to share along with our scientific projects. And one thing that's kind of cool here is that you are probably doing a lot of work in your research projects that normally nobody's going to get a chance to see, right? So in a lot of the labs that I've worked in, there's like this big research assistant manual that's got all this information about how we consent families or how we bring participants of different ages into the lab, or general stuff about how we set up our equipment. And those are really valuable documents, and they're often not the types of things that make it out into the light of day, but maybe that's something that you want to put alongside your project to say, like, here's actually the full story of how we do this research. So things you might include sharing are these sort of like internal instructions or more details about how you run a study, the actual code or Excel spreadsheets or whatever else it is that you're actually using to do the math, the data itself, we talked about the pre-registration plans, and then finally the preprint or possibly postprint of the journal articles that you're preparing. The pre-registrations and planning, it can often be a good place to start because they're your own plans, right? So typically speaking, there's not going to be like private data, maybe private stimuli or something that's needs to be licensed, that maybe there's a restriction on actually sharing that. If it's your own plan, that's often someplace where you're going to be in the clear to go ahead and share it. When we're thinking about sharing data in particular, this can be a place where there's a lot of concern or nervousness because we're also making, when we're doing human research, we have a contract that we're making with our participants. We're making some promises to them that we're going to use their data for scientific purposes and that we're going to treat it well, right? When we're thinking about how we share our data, one way that you can think about this is that you can think about kind of starting from the data that's kind of closest to the specific analyses that you're going to run, and then kind of expanding outward to provide more documentation and more context. So maybe you just want to kind of add the really specific variables that you need to calculate the data for this particular analysis. You can imagine sharing a full code book. So a code book or a data dictionary, just some place where you're defining what all of your variables are, what information you can expect to find in a data set. Maybe you've got this specific set of variables or specific set of observations that are going into your paper. And then maybe you want to also upload a full data set, but not share it, right? And that could be because you don't have permission to share it or because you're planning on doing more research and you're not ready to make the full data set public for everyone else yet. But you can absolutely, use this as a way to share part of your data set all the way through to sharing absolutely everything out of the data set that you have prepared. Another way that you can think about this as a continuum is to think about who is going to have access to the data. So whether you're sharing a big full data set or just part of one, you've probably seen this in papers. One way that you can make data available is to just write in the paper that you can contact the authors and they'll send them to you. And I don't know how many of you have tried this, but it can be really tough. And you can have a lot of empathy for this person, right? Because maybe this is research that you did 10 years ago. Maybe you were at a different institution when you did it. And then one day you get an email out of the blue and someone's saying, hey, can I see your data set from this paper you did a long time ago? And maybe it's on a laptop you haven't used in 5 years, right? So it's really easy to see why people do this, to say like, hey, I would be totally happy for someone to look at my data set, but I just don't really have a great way to, put it out yet. And I don't really feel like I want to put it on the open internet. So I'll just let somebody contact me. And that's something that's like, maybe it'll work really well in the first couple of months when you're publishing the paper. And then as time goes on, it's going to get harder and harder. Another thing that you can think about doing is essentially the same as available from the authors on request, but instead of storing it on your own laptop, you can consider storing it somewhere like the OSF. So you've got your files uploaded to the OSF. They're still in a private repository. You're still the only one who has access to it. But then if someone 10 years from now says, hey, I would love to see that data set, then you've got one place where you know that all your data sets live in these OSF components, OSF projects. And so then you might be able to go in there and share a link to them or to, get those files and share it with somebody else. So right now, we're not sharing our data any more than we might already be if we're not in a context where we're having open data, right? This is still private data. It's just instead of storing it in a Google Drive or on a physical drive in your lab, you're storing it privately on the COS servers or on an add-on server, but it's somewhere where it's a little bit more robust against changing institutions or having your laptop break down. Another thing that you can imagine doing, and if you work with large data sets in your research, you might have interacted with groups like this, is you can imagine handing over that data to another organization that's still going to keep it private from everybody, but which is going to have a process for researchers to get access to it. And that might be a process that involves you, the original researcher, or maybe not, but it's going to be, a set of people who have expertise in determining, how can this data be used safely and responsibly, and where you can apply to say, hey, I'd like to see these data, right? And then finally, if you have data where either maybe it's identifiable, but you've asked your participants if it's okay to share, and they say yes, you can publish that data in a public repository. If you've got data that doesn't identify your participants, so if you don't have any particular identifying information about them, it's always a great option to still ask your participants about absolutely everything. If you just get permission to share things, it's always much easier. But if you have data that really isn't identifiable, that may also be shareable. And that's something that you can talk about with your IRB or with your professors to figure out for your particular situation. So again, we're talking about making sure that when you share your data that you're doing so responsibly, that you've got permission from your participants, that you've got a good process for doing so. And if you determine like, hey, I need to be in situation 1 or 2, like I can't share my data publicly, something to keep in mind is you can almost always share your code book publicly, right? So this is something that you can give everybody a chance to see, and then maybe they could say like, oh my gosh, like this person says that they have this particular variable, and that's the variable I actually would want. So maybe I know it's worth my time, and I should be reaching out to these authors to see if I can get access to their data set on a more one-by-one basis. Okay, and then kind of continuing around the research cycle to get to preprints or postprints. This can be a little bit of a fuzzy distinction, but is mostly just referring to the idea that when you're preparing an article for publication, when you're submitting it to the article, the pre-reference, so it hasn't been peer reviewed yet, you're just submitting a version to that. It's often the case that you still have the right to publish that, to post it online wherever you want. This website, Sherpa Romeo, is actually super, super useful because it will give you, for any individual journal that you're considering submitting to, it will tell you like exactly what the rules are around what you can post and what you can't. So preprints before it's been through peer review, postprints, so that's actually like the final version of the paper. It's been through peer review, it's all ready to go, and typically the distinction between the postprint and then the final publisher's version is going to be if it still kind of looks like it's something that came out of a Word document on your computer versus if it's that nicely typeset and formatted version that you might have downloaded from the journals. And you can see that a website like this is also going to give you some details about what's okay and what's not okay. So oftentimes, for instance, there will be a distinction between putting your paper up any old where and putting it on like a personal website where people might be visiting to share with you. So this is a great way to kind of get your head around, is it okay for me to share my paper online? Once you've decided that you want to, there are a whole variety of ways, specific servers, just specific websites that are set up as a place for you to share that document so that researchers can start to find this, right? These have been in the news a little bit more, which is like both exciting and kind of scary because of COVID. The thing that's maybe most exciting about these preprint servers is that they're a way to get your research out fast, right? So this could be in the case because there's, a public health crisis and we really want to start getting things out, even if we know that like there may be some additional data or additional peer review that's going to go on. I think this is actually also a really, really valuable tool for graduate students, because you're not in control of how long the publication process is going to take, right? You can, you've got, your data collection process might hit snags or your analysis might be tougher than you expect, but mostly the process of getting to the draft that you submit is like more or less under like your control, to the degree that it's under anybody's control, right? Like that's up to you. You get it all the way through, you're ready to submit. and then you give it to a journal, and maybe the referees take a long time, or maybe they're not sure if your paper is the best fit for their journal. Maybe you're going to go to another journal. And it could take a lot of time to get through that process, and maybe you're getting ready to graduate, or maybe you're getting ready to go to a conference and you want people to be able to see your papers. The preprints are a way to, kind of as soon as you have an initial version of it ready, you can make that public. You can start for people to be able to read your papers and to, start being able to have stuff out there without being kind of at the mercy of however fast or slow a particular journal is. Okay. So that's about all of the material that I have for today. The big thing that I want to leave you with is to remember to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So I've talked about a bunch of different things that we can do. Talked about uploading your files to the OSF, either for archiving or for sharing, pre-registering your documents, sharing your data, posting a preprint, but you absolutely should not feel like you need to be doing every single one of these things right away. The way that I worked in graduate school and kind of the way that I've continued to work is anytime there's a new project, I look for what's the one thing that I can add on, right? So maybe the first time it's, hey, we didn't pre-register anything, but like I'm learning how to organize my files. I like want to make my data, more presentable so someone else can understand it. I'm going to upload data this time. And then maybe the next time it's time for pre-registration, or I'm getting antsy about a slow paper going through the journal, so I'm going to go ahead and put up a preprint. And so that's one kind of thing. You don't have to take on every single one of these activities in one research project. Take on one, see how it goes. And then the other thing is to remember that when you're trying this out, you don't have to get kind of all the way to the fanciest or kind of most perfect version of any of these. So for instance, when we talk about sharing our code, so the actual analyses that produce our results, that could be pretty intimidating, right? Like maybe someone's going to look at your code and saying, this is messy, or this isn't really the best way to do this. But really, really, anything that you share is so much more useful than absolutely nothing. Like a lot of what I do in my day-to-day job is work with whatever materials authors are able to share with me. And I can't tell you how much happier I am to have just like a simple Excel file with a couple of columns, and then I can see where they, highlighted the columns and made the formula for a t-test. I can see what they did. That is worlds and worlds and worlds better than nothing. Right? So I would encourage you to find those little things that you can share, those kind of first steps that you can take, because as soon as you start doing it, gets easier and easier over time.